Cadenza for Fractured Consciousness, A Personal History of the World's Most Misunderstood Illness by FND Portal. Read by Tom Plender. Part 2. A bit like a set of magic tricks. Back in 1995, John Stone was a new neurologist, settling into his first training position at a major UK medical centre. As is typical at this stage, he spent his days absorbing torrents of information from mentors and colleagues. He enjoyed honing the skills of diagnosing and treating complex brain conditions. But he was also dismayed by how doctors at the hospital treated people with certain disabilities. The attitude to patients with FND at that time was generally pretty shocking, he says. There was a culture of thinking that anybody that didn't have a structural disease or identifiable disease was in some way bogus, and actually the word bogus was used. I just couldn't understand it, because I thought, having met patients with it, they clearly do have these problems. They're not making it up. You only have to spend a bit of time talking to people to know that, and it's actually a very fascinating neurological problem. Why isn't someone interested? At weekly meetings, Stone saw doctors examine patients who came in for diagnosis. When the person left the room, the doctors laughed about their bogus psychogenic tremors and tics. These symptoms didn't just signify what a person had, they told you what a person was. My personal experience and subsequent research suggests that many American doctors don't know a functional disorder when they see one. By contrast, Stone says that in the UK hospitals, doctors were able to examine a patient and say, yeah, that's a functional disorder. They were just being secretive about it. This stuff wasn't really being taught, he says. You couldn't find it in a book, or certainly not a modern book. It was all in the old books, being handed down, word of mouth, a bit like a set of magic tricks. Stone chafed at these furtive, discriminatory practices. Having experienced a developmental stutter as a child, which recurred in his teenage years as a functional speech disorder, he wanted to give functional disorders another look. When he eventually found supportive mentors in Edinburgh, he and a small circle of collaborators got to work on reinvestigating the basic questions. Can it be shown that people with so-called conversion disorder are experiencing real disability? Are there reliable ways to tell if someone has it? And most importantly, is there any way to help them recover? We now have the advantage of hindsight. 2 decades of studies have answered each of these questions in the affirmative. Stone's research, much undertaken in collaboration with neuropsychiatrist Alan Carson, helped to develop and popularize methods of testing whether a person's symptoms stem from a functional disorder or a more familiar structural one. To do so, they combined modern neurology with guidance from those old books, among them the writings of Charcot. When they re-evaluated these medically unexplained patients with the tools of modern neurology, the tragedy of FND became clear. Carson and Stone found that people with FND are not merely the worried well, but rather demonstrably ill by the usual applied criteria of disability and distress. They were as severely disabled as people with epilepsy or Parkinson's. Doctors call them frustrating and difficult to treat, and their symptoms often never improved. Many patients remain symptomatic, distressed, and disabled as long as 12 years after the original diagnosis, Stone wrote in a 12-year follow-up study. Today, a number of American experts affirm this conclusion. FND causes very real disability and suffering, says Tolkien. Patients with FND are not faking their symptoms. Stone also publicised the unique features of the disorder, explaining how the once-secret diagnostic tricks worked, despite the opposition of some mentors and colleagues. These techniques now form the basis of how experts diagnose people with FND today. They look for specific idiosyncrasies that set functional disorders apart, rather than assuming, as many doctors once did, that anyone with medically unexplained symptoms has a functional disorder. You're looking for a pattern of weakness that only occurs in FND, Stone says. In the case of limb weakness, all the movements are equally weak. So if someone is trying to lift up their hip or press down their hip into the bed or chair, it's equally weak. And that's not a situation you see really in any other neurological condition. If someone has a stroke, they can usually push down their leg no problem. They just can't lift it up. Stone's retro-futuristic approach also shows how apparently dissimilar symptoms can share connections beneath the surface. You're looking for evidence of internal inconsistency, he says. The way in which someone can't make a movement, particularly when they're trying to, that's a hallmark. Their voluntary movements are impaired, but their automatic movements are intact. Not all movements are created identically in the brain. Some brain systems handle simple actions, like the curling of a fist. Others coordinate complex ones, like the multi-limbed cascades of a drum solo. Some guide intentional movements, and others seem to work without any conscious input. These neural fault lines come to the surface in people with FND. Understanding what breaks down in FND may ultimately tell us something about the functions of awareness, says Dr. Hakwon Lau, neuroscientist at the Riken Institute Center for Brain Science in Japan. Why do we need to be aware of our intentions in the first place? Can't things just go, so to speak, on autopilot? If FND does turn out to be due to impaired awareness of intentions, it does sound like such awareness may be quite important. Perversely, for people with FND, the focused intention to move seems to foul up the fluid movements the brain is normally capable of. Many of Stone's diagnostic tests therefore involve getting a person to redirect their attention elsewhere. When they do so, normal movements emerge. The sign itself is telling you about the condition, Stone says, and also showing the reversibility, potentially, of the condition. That's why when someone with left-hand tremors taps their right hand in time with Stone, the tremors lessen or stop entirely. That's why when he manipulates a limb in just the right way, weak patients find they briefly regain strength. Parts of the brain that control attention and which seem to worsen the symptoms have been forced to do something else. For a fleeting moment, the patient is no longer driving their body with the parking brake on. If FND classically surfaces as a kind of shape-shifting poltergeist, forever bedeviling the physician, these techniques reverse the relationship. Here, using principles of misdirection familiar to any magician, the doctor tricks the ghost. For patients who ache for answers, this can be revelatory. It shows that there is a concrete neurological basis for the disability. It's not that the person thinks they can't move. It's not that they won't move. There is a genuine impediment to doing so, and the fact of a clean MRI makes little difference. I really hope we look back with embarrassment at the way we've been practicing medicine, says Stone, which is based on the idea that we'll do something to help you if we can see it, but if we can't with the tools we have now, then we're inclined not to believe you, and we'll just leave you alone. That is a form of medical apartheid that's going on, I think, which I hope we'll look back on with shame. FND can, however, be seen with the advanced neuroimaging methods brain researchers use in the lab. And over the last 2 decades, techniques like fMRI have revealed the ghostly traces of FND in the brain. As early as 1997, scientists recorded abnormal brain activity in a woman with hysterical paralysis. In 2010, NIH researchers found that people with functional tremors had altered activity in a brain area called the temporoparietal junction, TPJ, which is involved with feelings of body ownership and control. Damage to the TPJ results in out-of-body experiences. So if activity in the TPJ is disrupted, that might explain why functional tremors, which occur via voluntary pathways, feel as though they can't be controlled. Other studies showed hyperactivation of the amygdala, the brain area thought to be involved with evaluating threats. Today, the Functional Neurological Disorder Research Group at Massachusetts General Hospital uses cutting-edge neuroimaging tools to investigate the biology of FND. Dr. David Perez, a dual-trained neurologist and psychiatrist who leads the group, describes FND as a multi-network problem, in which several core brain networks interact in abnormal ways to potentially produce the constellation of symptoms. To figure out how that happens, Perez's team used an analysis technique called stepwise functional connectivity to track how signals flow through the brains of people with FND. They found that the amygdala, the brain's center of subconscious threat processing, may be an important driver of FND symptoms. Psychological disorders like depression and anorexia are also visible on fMRI, but cause no large-scale damage to the brain. So how psychological is FND? Is it basically converted trauma, as Freud said, or is it only a neurological disorder, and not really a mind problem at all? In 2018, a team of researchers analysed the available studies on trauma and FND. In a systematic review, they revealed what many psychologists suspected. People with FND as a group have experienced stunningly high rates of adverse life events, including both physical and sexual abuse. That suggests psychological trauma may often contribute to FND. But starkly, up to a third of people with FND reported no such experiences. Carson says, "I do find that a lot of patients I see have been traumatized by people continually searching and asserting that such abuse must have happened. And where it is present," he says, "it tends not to be Freudian in nature." Other studies show that physical events like injuries, accidents, and surgeries are also common triggers. COVID-19 vaccinations have triggered FND in a number of people, and up to a third of people with Parkinson's may develop FND secondarily. In short, FND may often develop out of emotional trauma, but it can't just be that. We don't have the language to talk about a problem where the pendulum should be resting in the middle, Stone says, where we shouldn't even have these categories, which are meaningless, of neurological and psychological. More nuanced models may be needed. With some people, it doesn't matter how much sugar they have, they'll just get diabetes, Nicholson says. Whereas for other people, it's their diet and environment that'll trigger diabetes. For many, probably most, it's a combination. Likewise, some people will almost spontaneously get symptoms with essentially normal lives, with no stress or trauma. So they're just very biologically predisposed. Then there's other people for whom they need an environmental hit or two, which could be an early childhood trauma which affects the biology of their brain. This rejection of dualism and embracement of embodiment, the idea that the brain isn't separate from the body, but a part of it, and that mental and physical are tightly interwoven within its pathways, now resonates among many brain scientists beyond the FND niche. "I think these boundaries are artificial," says Lau, reflecting on the mind versus brain question in FND. "They may exist for good institutional and logistical reasons, but we can't hold on to them like they are absolute rules." Spirits in the material world. Indeed, since the turn of the century, many of the traditional rules of neurology have dissolved in the face of contrary evidence. In their place emerges a radically new vision of human selfhood, one in which the mind is not a non-physical substance, but a process that emerges from properties of the brain, and one in which biology and mental life are inextricably, even gloriously intertwined. It is to this transformed landscape that FND has returned, this time to a decidedly different reception. Once derisively likened to malingering, researchers now say the condition may provide insights into core mysteries of selfhood, that feeling of owning a living body, of being a coherent self, tied to a remembered past and imagined future. It also lends weight to a startling theory, that what we experience as consciousness is a kind of simulation created by the brain. That last part is surprisingly easy to test. For example, one odd feature of the human eye is the physiological blind spot, a dead zone on the retina where there are no photoreceptor cells to capture light. If what you're seeing right now strictly matches the light patterns that are striking your eye, then you should have two blind spots, one for each eye, right near the center of your vision. Not seeing them? That's because the brain covers them up. The blind spot test throws a wrench in the brain's magic show. Like FND, it demonstrates that the brain is never fully telling us the truth. Instead, evolution has bequeathed us something stranger, not a window to the world, but a kind of helpful hallucination machine. And the brain, researchers believe, generates this simulation using an amazing kind of guesswork called prediction. Prediction solves one of the brain's great quandaries, that it never gets to directly meet the world. The brain, said neuroscientist Anil Seth in a viral 2017 TED Talk, is locked inside a bony skull, trying to figure out what's out there. In its skull prison, the brain never sees the gleam of the sun, or feels a rushing sea breeze, or smells the salty air. All it has access to are the streams of nerve impulses beaming in from every part of the body. Without direct knowledge of the world, it has to play a game of interpretation. That's what prediction is. The brain's attempts to explain what these body signals mean. This is why Seth, somewhat controversially, describes all perception as a kind of controlled hallucination. We're never just passively perceiving the world around us, he says. Rather, the brain is actively constructing the experience. Prediction turns ambiguous lines and shadows into cohesive images, airborne pressure vibrations into music, and nerve signals from the body's interior into hunger, comfort, restlessness, and pain. But it's not just about what we feel. Prediction also guides our movements, providing anticipatory control over the body. This is how a professional golfer can hit a ball in one direction, sensing intuitively that it will end up somewhere else entirely. Their brain has learned, through a lifetime of sensory experience, the physics of the ball and the landscape and what it feels like to make a perfect swing. The brain simulates what will happen before it does. Then it affirms its own prophecy by fulfilling it. Carl Friston, the most highly cited researcher in brain science, characterizes prediction as the unifying logic of the brain. In this view, all aspects of the brain, our thoughts, emotions, movements, speech, and even the feeling of having a coherent self, are enabled by and products of predictive processes. If that's true, what we call a self, the complex mind-body construct that creates a feeling of you, may not be so much a thing that is, so much as a thing that happens. In conditions like hemispatial neglect, brain damage can make a person fail to recognize that they possess one side of their body. Such disorders of embodiment suggest that, at least in healthy people, brain networks use prediction to maintain a dialogue between each other and the body, conjuring a unified self in the way that a jazz performance arises from the overlapping contributions of multiple players. Selfhood is harmony. Selfhood is consensus. Like hemispatial neglect, FND may be a tragic example of what happens when the music goes wrong. When someone has an injury or experiences an acute mental crisis, their patterns of brain activity change. Defense-related areas, like the amygdala, erupt in alarm. They bombard the brain's motor systems with signals, producing movements that can't be controlled. If you've ever felt your hand shake after narrowly avoiding a car accident, you've experienced this in passing. The amygdala also amplifies body feelings, like pain. This draws attention to the body and gives the person a chance to tend to injury. Unfortunately, attention also acts as a signal amplifier in the brain, and in FND, that's gasoline to a fire. It could be any sensory stimulus, says Stone. Sleep paralysis, migraine aura, just tripping up on the street. Something draws your attention and makes you think, something's gone wrong, I wasn't expecting that. That's enough to put the wheels in motion and mangle the software of your brain. As the crisis escalates, the brain's predictions start to shift. The involuntary movements increase and the person becomes aware that they're losing control of their body. Anxiety or panic may set in. Then comes the tipping point. The brain's usual predictions, its old, steady ways of managing the body, no longer hold up against the assault of contradictory feelings or prediction error. The brain abandons its old predictive schema and creates a new one, patterned after the crisis at hand. A man lies in a hospital bed, his arm healed of injury, but still unable to move. The brain learns the injury, absorbs it, and then it reenacts it forever. This is, strictly speaking, a psychological process, but does that word really capture the profound physicality of what people experience in these moments when a body that was once familiar becomes alien? Professor Andy Clark, neuroscientist at the University of Sussex, writes that the dysfunction of FND might be thought of as cybernetic, as an imbalance in the complex inner economy of evidence, inference, and control. Carson similarly describes the condition as the price of how our brain works. The brain is always constructing a self, always creating and inferring its connections to the body. FND, he says, exposes the joints of the process. The experience of a coherent bodily self comes from a neural system that mediates a relationship between our bodies, the world, and our conscious experience, says Professor Mark Edwards, a neurologist at St George's University Hospital who specialises in FND. And if systems exist, they have to be able to go wrong, he says. In a way, it would be extraordinary if functional symptoms didn't exist. Rather, when the systems that link mental intent and physical response break, you would expect exactly the kind of problems that people with functional neurological disorder report. I've learned how tenuous those links can be. Sometimes it feels like my limbs are only loosely attached to my torso, or that I'm clipping through the boundaries of my skin. Sometimes the quality of my vision degrades, as if there's radio interference in my eyeballs. This splintering of self is the defining experience of FND. I tell people I can see the glitch in the matrix, says Claudia, who experiences visual disruptions due to the condition. There are now some early hints at the role emotions may play in this process. The brain areas most implicated in FND, the amygdala, insular, and anterior cingulate cortex, among a handful of others, are also linked to conditions like depression, anxiety, and bipolar disorder. And listening to people with FND leaves little doubt that emotion can play a powerful role in driving symptoms. But the disorder, nevertheless, continues to defy simple emotional explanations. There are plenty of people with FND whose symptoms don't respond to overt emotions, but who are easily triggered by sensory overstimulation, somewhat similar to what people with autism report. And the reason for this emotional sensory overlap may be embedded in the architecture of the brain itself. The brain areas associated with FND are part of the limbic system, which are traditionally considered the emotional parts of the brain. But according to neuroscientists Ian Kleckner and Lisa Feldman Barrett, there are no dedicated emotion circuits in the brain. Kleckner currently leads a lab dedicated to brain-body interactions in cancer control at the University of Maryland. Barrett, a professor at Northeastern University, is a leading scientist in the study of emotion, listed among the top 1% most cited scientists in the world. That's not to say these systems play no role in emotions. They do. But the networks that produce emotion also support a staggering variety of other functions besides. They regulate the body's physiology, keeping us from freezing to death or overheating in summer. In a brain scanner, limbic areas light up for psychological experiences ranging from pain and addiction to feelings of empathy. They are necessary for basic psychological functions, like snapping out of a daydream to pay attention to what someone's saying. Some parts, like the anterior insula, are essentially on all the time. Given that, Kleckner and Barrett write that these limbic areas are better understood as members of a larger core system in the brain, which they dub the interoceptive network. Interoception is a bodily sense, like sight or hearing, that most people don't know they have. Dr. Sarah Garfinkel, a neuroscientist at University College London who specialises in interoception research, describes it as how we experience and sense the inside world. Interoception is an embodying process. It's how you feel the pounding of your heartbeat, the ache of muscle fatigue, and the pangs of hunger. It's also critical to managing your body's energy budget and coping with physiological stress. It may provide the biological basis for emotion as well. One current theory is that emotions are essentially the brain's interpretation of interoceptive signals, that emotional feeling states arise from physiological changes from within the body. These core systems are where emotion, thought, perception, and physiological regulation come together, the literal heart of the matter. And for Kleckner and Barrett, there is one common purpose underlying this system's myriad abilities: survival. Positioned at the anatomical and functional core of the nervous system, they write, whatever else this system might be doing, remembering, directing attention, and so on, it is also predictively regulating the body's physiological systems. By linking emotions to physical states, they write, this network dissolves the artificial boundary between mind and body and unifies mental and physical illness. These high-level brain networks, where emotion and bodily signals intertwine, sometimes indistinguishably, may explain why people acquire FND from both physical and emotional traumas, because they affect the same systems. I think it makes perfect sense fitting in with what this circuitry does, says Kleckner. These brain networks strongly respond to the physical requirements of the body, as well as to psychological and social events, which are only one step away from a bodily biological requirement. Through FND, we are now learning more about what happens when these networks of embodiment come apart. In a recent study, Garfinkel and colleagues found that people with functional seizures showed substantial mismatches between different aspects of their interoceptive body sensing skills. In the study, people with FND felt they were good at gauging their internal sensations, but when tested, performed poorly. Evidence is emerging at the moment that there may be impaired interoceptive accuracy in FND, says Garfinkel. Maybe they're not able to sense and use these signals in the same way. And being in tune with your body may be quite important. If that's impaired, then that can correlate with higher levels of dissociation, she says. In the study, these discrepancies predicted both how often people had seizures as well as their overall tendency to dissociate. When you start to get increases and decreases and gaps, she says, this can have consequences, potentially for symptoms. There are early indications that mind-body interfacing may have significant implications for FND. Dr. Aaron Fobian, a psychiatrist at the University of Alabama, recently took a body-focused approach in a pilot study of children with functional seizures. Rather than trying to heal each child's potential emotional trauma in the hopes that FND would improve, she decided to target the symptoms directly. Treatment focused on training children to reinterpret their body signals and practice movements that counteract the onset of seizures, a technique inspired by similar treatments for Tourette syndrome. The results were so successful that the university's statistician ended the trial early. 100% of patients were seizure-free after a week, and 82% remained seizure-free 2 months later. I don't want to overstate the evidence. These studies are small and will need replication. But elsewhere, other researchers using mind-body approaches are also finding avenues of success. Physiotherapy is emerging as an effective treatment for functional movement disorders, giving previously paralyzed people the ability to walk again. CBT can also be helpful, both to decrease symptoms in some people as well as ease the emotional burdens of living with them. And the next generation of treatments may be around the corner. At Stanford University, neuropsychiatrist Dr. Kim Bullock is trialling a virtual reality form of mirror therapy, which she says may serve both as a tool to desensitize FND patients to their triggers, as well as a possible means of sensory motor reprogramming. In essence, the program uses a computational simulation of reality to reprogram the brain's biological one. The hidden door. I'm part of the first generation of patients to benefit from this new approach. 6 months after getting diagnosed by the NIH team at Bethesda, I began my treatment at Massachusetts General Hospital, where neuropsychiatrist Dr. David Perez oversees the largest American FND treatment clinic. There are traditional doctor's offices here, but also rooms that look more like a Planet Fitness, full of yoga balls, workout machines, and cushioned floor mats. Here, Perez helped me to begin to make sense of the disorder and introduced me to a team of physical and occupational therapists. He taught me through the options: movement retraining, cognitive behavioral therapy, sensory diets to manage overwhelming stimuli. On his advice, I tried all three. I'm glad no one suggested it would be easy. Even as I worked through the therapies, I developed new symptoms, including a persistent tinnitus that still rings in my ears today. Fortunately, the effort still paid off. One day, while experimenting with body scan techniques, I stumbled upon a method that helped me start to regain control. I'd been in bed for most of the day, in the throes of searing back pain, when I noticed that my shoulder muscles were subtly flexing, the way one might brace oneself to bang open a door that has frozen shut. They were tiny movements, almost invisible to the naked eye, but I wondered if they might be linked to the pain in some way. Then the image of my shoulder banging a frozen door appeared. I thought, this is a protective response. My body is trying to brace me for something. Experimenting a little, I found that while I couldn't control the muscles directly, I could shift my mind out of its defensive clench and into something much more open and fluid, the way one might accept and even welcome an impact when one has planned for it, like exuberantly whacking a punching bag. When I did this, the muscles released and the pain disappeared. It felt like a scene from The Princess Bride, in which Inigo Montoya discovers the passageway to a hidden laboratory by leaning on a tree. Door after door opened. It took time and many false starts, but my symptoms began to stabilize and then to recede. I found I could walk for longer, work more consistently, and felt less pain. When a limb started to twitch, I'd pull my attention off it, occupy myself with other movements, or moderate my pain with deep breaths. I came back to balance with my body. In 2018, I had over 150 days of headache and was hospitalized multiple times. In 2019, I had 3 and recovered at home on the couch. With the storm clouds of pain and physical trauma receding, I began to enjoy even banal experiences more. The first time I did a full sink of dishes without spasming, I became so giddy I felt like I was high. Meanwhile, the embryonic community of FND activists has undergone an even more unlikely transformation. The so-called hysteric of yesteryear held almost no power. They were treated medically and socially however society saw fit. They had no platform from which to speak, and indeed were often told they were the cause of their disability. But that too has begun to shift. People with FND have harnessed internet platforms to tell our stories and advocate for disability justice. Meg, who experiences functional seizures and memory loss, shares candid footage of life with FND to 850,000 followers on TikTok. Others discuss experiences of stigma, their own techniques for recovery, or their evolving understanding of how FND manifests in the body. Inevitably, to follow these voices is to see the hysterical stereotypes fall away, replaced by the familiar faces, local news anchor, college art student, devoted parent, that people with functional disorders have always been. Whether this will translate into lasting social acceptance remains to be seen. Is our society prepared to embrace a more mature understanding of brain-body illness? Are we ready to honour the experiences of people with FND in all their poignancy and complexity? Stone sees reason for hope. It's interesting how things can change quite quickly if society changes its predictive model, he says. Is society ready to think about functional disorders? It might be, I think. Attitudes to mental health are changing quite rapidly, and we've seen how attitudes to other conditions like autism have changed. So I'm going to remain optimistic. When I began writing this, I still agonised about carrying the shame of FND. In an early taste of prevailing attitudes, someone close to me suggested that I was a fucking hypochondriac. There are countless similar stories of people with FND being treated as if they are at fault for being ill. Maybe at some level I knew that this is what a conversion disorder diagnosis would mean. Perhaps that's why, when I was first diagnosed, I felt flooded with deep shame. I dreaded that my friends would think I was faking or being dramatic. Maybe I thought they'll think I just can't handle stress. Maybe they'll think there was no disability, only elaborate self-deception. I worried that they'd no longer see me as genuinely disabled, just messed up. But talking with other people with FND helped me understand these are common feelings, and I need not carry them alone. They inspired me to track the story of FND from the beginning, and to open up to the people in my life. And I did. I told my friends and loved ones what I found digging through musty libraries, interviewing researchers, and speaking with the people quoted here. I told them how it felt that I could no longer access my limbs, and the pain of not being able to tell anyone why. And despite my dread, those who saw me lose ownership of my body did what I needed most. They believed me. Some shared their own struggles with anxiety and chronic pain. No one told me I wasn't really disabled. No one told me I wasn't really hurting. Time in the FND world helped me cast a new eye on my own history too. When I participated in a research study on those infamous adverse life events, I realised what I considered typical experiences might not be. My childhood, while bolstered by a tight-knit family and privileged in many ways, was also marred by intense bullying. I was often in fights, and in my teenage years struggled with depression and anxiety. As an adult, I saw a stranger commit suicide, and a few times narrowly avoided being shot. These things are stark fact, and yet they were also separated by long years in which I was happy, sometimes unhappy, and often in between. The truth is, in my adult life before FND, I mostly felt fine. But I've also come to see how distant events, some removed by years or decades, could set the stage for the devastation that followed. With every experience, the neurons fire, the chemicals release, the dendrites branch. Everything leaves an imprint on the brain. My recovery is not yet complete. Every day I brush against some boundary my body can't pass. There are still things I long to do, like go for a long hike in the woods, that I can't. The symptoms return when I get sick, transforming a cold into something much worse. I'm not cured and may never be, but I have improved nevertheless. I'm stronger and feel more grounded in myself, and I've realised I don't have to have a perfect body to have a good one. And then there's this new feeling. I've seen a little of the magic at work, the subtle connections that bind body to mind, indeed, that generate me. And I'm astonished. What a gift to be and be created by this strange prediction machine. This is what FND, with all its glitchy gesticulations, ultimately revealed to me when it exposed the joints of my world. It also highlighted its stunning design. Were it not for my admittedly faulty brain, I would never feel the soft lips of my lover, or the pleasant jolt in my bones of the train as it lurches, or the breeze through the leaves in the morning. And sometimes there are moments of amazing normality when I'm not in pain or glitching out, and I feel a sudden rush of ecstasy like gold in my blood. Was all this real or a simulation? Shall we say both? My brain predicted it, and somehow it came into being. It brought me agony and despair, long nights in the hospital, the feeling of being wrenched from my body like a passenger through a windshield. But then, too, the warm dusks that linger for hours in the summer, the otherworldly frog chorus in the distance, the burst of strawberries like fireworks on my tongue. Maybe I've lost control of my hallucinations somewhat. Let me ask you, should I be ungrateful? Every moment I'm living, every flavour and texture and heartbeat and hum, every kiss and homecoming, every night in the arms of the one I love, all of it I receive through this. If that's not magic, you tell me what is.